Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to a video about which 4-star you should get from Lantern Rite. Obviously, if there's a character that you just really like because you think they're very pog, don't let it not being optimal stop you from enjoying the video game. This is for people that are struggling to decide based on how good it actually is. If how good it actually is doesn't matter to you, just go for whichever character you find the most fun. With that out of the way, let's go over the 9 characters currently available and the 1 character that is going to be coming out soon that are available for Lantern Rite and which one you should get. First off, Xinyan. Xinyan is not very good. None of her constellations are all that insane because, while some of them are fairly useful in terms of increasing what she does from C0 to C6, she's pretty bad at C6, and so, yeah. My Xinyan is somewhat built, right? She's 9, 11, 11. She's not currently wearing an artifact set, but I've played her a bunch. She's not very good. I've still had a blast with her. I'd say this constellation is like kind of a lot worse than it looks because her charge attacks are just really not that good. The physical res shred can situationally be useful, but I've found that her teams that have been the strongest and that have been the most fun to play are teams where you just use her with C6 Bennett, and so she does pyro damage, so this doesn't do that much. Well, C2's kind of nice, but overall it's really not all that great. So it's really just if you really like her. And next we have Chongyun, who is honestly in a similar boat. Now, I've played a lot of Chongyun back in the day. I used to be a Bennett main, and so I played a lot of Melt Bennett. Chongyun does have some value, but the reality is that he was never all that strong, and with the release of new units, he's just been left behind completely. He can still be fairly valuable for shield breaking. If you specifically need cryo application and you don't have a cryo character built, then Chongyun can be useful. I remember in patch, I believe it was 1.4, with the release of Lectors and Heralds, there was an Abyss floor where on floor 11 you had 2 Hydro Heralds, and you had the cooldown debuff of slowing waters, which made it so that you couldn't just use your cooldowns as usual, and so Chongyun's E was pretty useful for that. But like from a meta perspective, he really doesn't have too much value outside of that. The C2 is useful because it gives you some CDR, but even with that CDR, it's still very hard to justify putting him in a team optimally. He can get melts on his burst, but that's really all the damage he does, so it doesn't tend to be all that strong overall. And like in terms of his individual constellations, his C6 is pretty good, his C3 is pretty good, and his C2 is pretty good. The rest are not very good. The only teams where you tend to use him are either teams where you're using him for the shield breaking, so you're not really staying on field with him, so the C1 and C4 don't do anything, or teams where you're melting, and so you're not hitting opponents affected by cryo, so the C4 doesn't do anything. So it's really mainly C1, C2, 3, and 6 that are like the better ones, but again, he's really a character that is not all that recommendable unless you just really like him. And that's it for the characters that I would recommend staying away from unless you just really like them. So next we can talk about some of the characters that are fairly niche but do have some use case in some situations, and talk about what those situations are. First, Yunjin. Yunjin is a normal attack buffer, and therefore is only useful with characters that focus on normal attacks. But there's a caveat to that, which is that because of the way that her quota works, she's only really good in situations where you're not using up all of your things too early, which makes her fairly weak in AoE situations where you will consume more of your trigger quota. I know a lot of people have talked about her with Ayato. She doesn't actually tend to be a very strong option for Ayato, and then on top of that, Ayato hyper teams don't tend to be very strong. So if that's where you'd want to play her, she really falls on the category of like only good if you really like her. But she has some characters that she works with where she is actually not in that category. The first one that comes to mind, obviously, is Yoimiya. Yunjin is famously a pretty synergistic character with Yoimiya. And yeah, she's pretty alright. I wouldn't really use her in Yoimiya's optimal teams generally, but she is a very solid option, and a lot of the characters that you would use in Yoimiya's optimal teams are characters that are also good in a lot of other teams, so being able to play Yunjin can let you get away with not playing some of those other characters and using them on other teams, which is nice. The biggest downside with Yunjin is her energy. energy. Her energy cost isn't that high at 60, but she only has one way to generate energy, which is her skill, obviously. And her skill only hits once. And the reality is very often you're going to want to use her on Favonius Lance. And when you have a skill that only hits once, it is a lot harder to proc the Favonius Lance. And unlike a lot of other characters that use Fav weapons, Yunjin does not want to have to build crit. Because her buff from the burst scales with her defense and does not scale with her crit, rather scaling with the crit of the character who's getting the buff, then building crit on her will decrease the damage you're doing with her burst. Which means that unlike characters like Xingqiu, for example, who tend to, really like having crit rate because, that's how they deal their damage, and so it's very easy to get enough crit to proc Fav, with Yunjin, you'll have to choose it very often. In a perfect world, you'd like to have defense main stats with a lot of crit rate and ER substats, but that can be pretty hard to get, especially with the fact that a lot of people don't tend to look at the substats of their defense main stat pieces and end up feeding pieces that could have rolled good for Yunjin, never really giving them a shot. So that's a potential issue you might run into if you want to play Yunjin. That doesn't make her unplayable, but it is something that you should be aware of. And that makes it so that her ER requirements tend to be a huge pain in the ass in any team where you're not playing double Geo. And even with double Geo, if it's something with like Zhongli and the pillar breaks, it's as if you're not playing double Geo, so it's kind of rough still. When it comes to her constellations, the C1 doesn't do anything because you're not swapping into her every time her E is available anyways. C2 is a nice little normal attack bonus. C3 gives her talent levels on burst, which is somewhat useful. C4 is technically useful, but it's not that significant. C5 is pretty bad, and C6 gives you some attack speed, which is also pretty nice. Overall, I'd say that she actually has fairly reasonable constellations. She doesn't get that much stronger from C0 to C6, but most of her constellations are like fine. Next in a similar category is Ning. And honestly, if you had asked me a month ago, I would have probably put Ning with Xinyan and Chongyun. However, with the release of Navia, Ning actually has a real team now. It's technically not her only real team. I did a decent amount of Ning in some weird 25-second rotation. Visual Ning, Zhongli, I think it was Beidou? Maybe it was Beidou. They were fine, but not great. With the Navia teams, by the time this video comes out, the Navia post-release should be out, so you can see more thoroughly explained thoughts on her synergy with Navia in there. But for those who didn't watch, effectively, Ning's numbers are not all that great, but she has very good synergy with what Navia would want out of a Geo teammate, which makes it so that she is actually a pretty good teammate for Navia. It's not significantly above any of the other teammates, but it is one of the things you can do. And if you like Ning, then that's cool. One thing I will say though, Ning is one of those 4 stars that is a lot weaker at C0. Mainly, her C2 is a pretty big power spike. Her talent constellations are also fairly useful, and her C6 is also a pretty big power spike. And when I talk about her just not being all that great, I'm talking about at C6. So at C0, it's very hard to get good results out of her. But if you have a few constellations on her, maybe you're currently C5, you can get her C6, whatever, something like that, and you actually do have Navia and are planning to use her with Navia, then that's something you can consider. One thing I do want to mention about this though is that in my Navia testing, which is somewhat limited because I didn't end up getting Navia on my own account, so I only did some testing on other accounts, I've generally preferred playing GeoMC to almost basically any of the other Geo units with Navia. I've just felt like the synergy was nicer due to the much lower field time requirements that GeoMC has, which help you a lot with that team because you get to spend a bit more time on Navia, which is nice, compared to Ning's much longer animations. So that is something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind that can maybe turn you off of wanting to go for Ning is that she is significantly worse if you're not like going out of your way to place your wall properly. And against a lot of enemies, against a lot of bosses, it can be a huge pain in the ass to actually get your wall placement to work out. The issue is that bosses are coded so that if their hitbox overlaps with Ningguang's wall hitbox, it just makes the wall disappear. And because Ningguang's burst deals basically double the damage if you have a wall, right? Then losing your wall will significantly nerf the amount of damage you're doing from your burst, right? Compared to actually getting
Don't waste my time.
Oh, there I missed my E. You gotta try to make it so that the E is close enough to the boss that it deals damage, but far enough that it doesn't get destroyed. Yeah, there we go. So I got the damage and it didn't get destroyed. And then you have to like dash backwards to do it. I put up on the second one, but whatever. If you're willing to do that and work around that when you're against bosses, then there's no real problem. But if that's something that sounds like a huge pain in the ass to you, then maybe Ning's not for you. Finally, let's talk about Yanfei. Yanfei's another character where like she's fine. The most relevant discussion in terms of her meta power isn't even about her traditional playstyle. You can use Yanfei as a carry, and especially with the release of Farina, she now has a few more options for teams, which is nice. And in general, vape teams that use the strong Hydro supports tend to be strong enough to get through Abyss without too much of an issue, even when the carry is not very strong. So if you just really like Yanfei, you can use her for that. But I think that the most relevant meta discussion for Yanfei is about her Constellation 4, which gives you a shield for 45% of her max HP when you use your burst. It's a pretty damn tanky shield, but Yanfei's energy generation isn't the greatest, and her burst is very expensive at 80 cost. Which means that in most situations, you kind of have to run either Prototype Amber or Fav on her. Generally, people tend to run Proto Amber, which means that you can't run something like TTDS, and then you're just running a shielder where all they do is shielding, and that can be fine, but it's not ideal. It's just, yeah. And especially if you're looking for a Pyro Shielder, Toma is a fairly good option, so in a lot of situations, it would be worse than Toma. That being said, it can be nice, and so if you are, at C3, that could be a playstyle you can unlock by getting that C4. If you're looking only at her performance as a carry, all in all, the constellations are nice, but none of them are like all that insanely strong. The C6 is a nice little boost, but it's not even that huge of a deal. But she is a normal attack focused character, well, normal and charge attack, which means that the skill and burst talent constellations really don't do that much for her. You do get a bit of charge attack damage bonus out of it, but it's fairly insignificant in the grand scheme of things. The C2 gives you some crit rate, but only against enemies below 50% health. All in all, none of her constellations particularly stand out outside of the shield one. And that is it for the characters that are like niche, not that great, you might want in some situations, but still generally wouldn't be like the number one choice for many people. And now we're getting into the ones that are pretty good. First, let's talk about Yaoyao. I'd say that out of the characters that are left, Yaoyao is probably the least likely one that you should get. And the main reason for that is not because Yaoyao is the worst one out of the remaining characters, but rather because every single one of her constellations except her C6 is pretty f***ing dog shit. They're not completely useless, but they're very insignificant. And then the C6 is nice, but it's not that huge of a deal. Which means that she's already almost fully realized at C0. And if you have her already, getting her is probably not a great idea. Yaoyao has the highest healing in the game out of any healer, but does need to stay on field for a little bit in order to get that healing. She also tends to be the best 4-star Dendro option in many teams, especially when you're able to pair her with either an Electro or Anemo healer. On the other side, her application isn't the greatest from off-field, so when you're looking at her in Hyper Bloom teams, for example, you are losing a decent amount of damage using her instead of a non-healing character that is more focused on application. But obviously, outside of Nahida, we don't have too many of those that are all that great. If you have Nahida, I think she loses a decent amount of value because unless you want to be running a Dendro team on both sides, which is not bad, but I don't think there's that many people that want to do that. It's very rare that Yaoyao is good with Nahida in teams, and so in teams where you're playing Nahida, you wouldn't really need her. And she doesn't have the best synergy in a lot of the Farina teams, because in Farina teams, what you're looking out of your healer is you're looking for a healer that can replace another character in the team, and so Yaoyao's weaker Dendro application tends to be a bigger deal, and if you have Beidou, you would tend to rather run him over her, because it is nice to be able to run a healer, and so in order to get all the value out of Farina's passive. Anyways, her constellation's really like the C1 gives you some Dendro damage, but you don't really play her with Dendro carries too often. Gives you some stamina, which is not completely useless, but not great either. C2 is some energy, but her healing is so good and her damage is so irrelevant that you can just build fully R anyways, so this doesn't do too much. C3 and 5 are talent levels, will just increase her already over-the-top healing. C4 gives her EM, but her damage doesn't tend to be that great, so it doesn't matter too much. And then C6 gives her additional application, which is nice, but it's only twice over a rotation, so it's not that big of a deal. Next, the one, the only chef from Liyue is Xiangling. It is no surprise that Xiangling is a very good unit. Unlike many of the other characters on this list, she is available for free to every account, guaranteed. You get her from clearing floor 3 of Spiral Abyss, which means that it's not a question of how good is she at all, it's a question of how good each of her constellations is. Xiangling C1 is useful, but it's not a huge deal. Xiangling C2 might as well not exist. Xiangling C3 is pretty good. Xiangling C4 is really good. Now, free C4 Xiangling is still a reasonably good unit, but isn't insanely strong, and she wouldn't have the place in the meta that she had if she was always C0. The C4 is a pretty big deal, and I would say that with the amount of options that are becoming available to players with time, it's less and less recommendable to try to force a Xiangling team if you don't have her C4. That being said, she is a character that is available in the shop, like in the circulator shop, I meant for shop, and in Lantern Rite, which means that she's one of the characters for whom it is the easiest to get constellations. Because if you get her from the shop once and you get her from Lantern Rite, you only need 2 of them to have her C4 because you get 1 for free from Abyss. She is arguably the character that is the easiest to get to C4. And so her reliance on C4 isn't as much of a downside as it would be for a newer character that is not available in the shop, not in Lantern Rite, not given for free, and not available on banners until they come out. C5 doesn't really matter that much, and C6 does not apply to her own power NATO, so it's not very good in most situations. If you don't currently have the strongest Abyss teams and are not at C4 yet, it is very possible that Xiangling is the best choice for you on Lantern Rite. But if you do already have some other options, it is not necessary to go for that. And I would rather maybe focus on getting constellations on the #1 choice in this list, which we'll get to at the very end. Next, we have Beidou. The current overall community perception on Beidou, I think, is pretty wrong. I think that a lot of people underestimate Beidou and don't really play her, so they don't realize that they're underestimating her. Now, Beidou is not perfect, and don't get me wrong, she has her own flaws, but she is a very good unit in AoE situations, as long as you're against more than one enemy and her burst can bounce. She's pretty good for damage, but also, and maybe more importantly, she is a damage-focused unit that offers you a lot of defensive utility. The resistance to interruption and the damage reduction that you get from her burst are very, very valuable in a lot of situations. And the only reason why they tend to not be focused on too much is because I think people focus too much on how her damage falls off in single target. That being said, she also has some other weaknesses. She is fairly reliant on her C2, right? Her C2 makes the total amount of hits you get from her burst go from 3 to 5, which is a pretty big difference. And obviously, she's not very good in single target because you only get 1 instead of 3 or 5. But if you have her C2 and you're in AoE, she is actually a very good character. She also has very high stagger, both on her parry and her burst. That being said, her constellations past C2 are not as strong. A bunch of them are good, like they're not bad. Namely, I think her C4 is a bit better than people give it credit for, because it's not about how much damage it does, it's about the fact that when you have her C4, you can on-field her to proc Fischl's Constellation 6 against elemental shields and get significantly better shield breaking in Taser and Aggravate teams than you quote-unquote should be able to get. But none of her constellations past C2 are like that insanely big of a deal, but I think it's pretty hard to recommend actually playing her if you don't have that C2. Next is the new Gaming. I haven't recorded it yet, but I will get into Gaming's kit in a lot more detail in a pre-release. I am planning on making a pre-release video on him. If it's already out, it'll be in the description. Otherwise, you can subscribe and and it'll come out soon. He's a strong unit with caveats. Overall, like in his best case scenario, he's actually a pretty good unit. The thing is, there's a lot of factors that can prevent him from being in his best case scenario. First, his constellations are pretty good, especially his C6. The difference between a C5 gumming and a C6 gumming is pretty significant, which means that while that does mean that, ooh, constellations are nice on him, he's a new 4-star who is not available in the shop, which means it might take you a while to actually get all the way to C6. On top of that, his teams will tend to be a bit weaker if you're not planning to go for Xiangling or Cloud Retainer, who's going to be coming soon. And then finally, I think that he has some potential gameplay issues with the way that his kit works, where he's going to be at the mercy of auto-targeting. Effectively, when he uses E, he dashes forward towards an enemy and then goes up, but then you have to plunge, and you can't change your angle from which you're plunging. You can't go forward, you can't glide, otherwise you lose the enhanced plunge, and it's gonna make it so that you need to pay a lot more attention to your positioning than if you were to be playing a character like Xiao, for example, who can just dash forward a little bit and reposition himself while he's jumping. All of that being said, if you do have Xiangyun, and especially if you have C6 Bennett, even at C0, he's going to be a fairly decent carry. And if you don't have Xiangyun, you can make him work in some melt teams with maybe Rosaria, and it should work out somewhat, but then you're even more at the mercy of positioning because Rosaria's burst has a limited area as well, and then yeah, that's starting to be a bit more rough. But that is a team where he can be, you know, a fairly decent carry even at C0. And finally, and that's the biggest upside for him, his animations look so fucking good. I'm like convinced that half of the animation department at Hoyo is Cantonese and has been waiting for a Cantonese character for 3 years just so that they could go fucking ham on him. Personally, I'm leaning towards going for him, mainly because of the animation and because I already have C6 over number 1, the best unit in the game, Xingqiu. Everything about Xingqiu has been said before, right? So this is not going to be anything new. But for those of you that are very new to this channel or want to have it laid out so that they can make their decision more easily, he's used in basically half the teams in the game. He's very fucking good. He is so good that even at C0, he is worth using. But then on top of that, every single one of his constellations other than C1 is pretty good. I'd say that his weakest constellation other than C1 is probably his C5. The elemental skill talent level, but even then it gets you one step closer to the C6, which is arguably his best constellation. It's between his C6 and his C2, and so you don't even feel that bad about it. The biggest downside is that Xingqiu is often on banner with characters that are not the greatest because he's so good, and so if you already have his C6, and it makes those banners a lot less appealing, especially if you want the 5-star. But like the fact that that's probably his biggest downside tells you all you need to know about how good he is. I guess the only other downside is that he's available in the shop, so you can get his constellations elsewhere. And I guess, yeah, also there are some teams where you don't necessarily want to use him. A few Farina teams, especially. But even then, he's still a decent option in a lot of them. Even when he's not like necessary for the team to work, he does tend to be a very nice. Even in the teams where he's not necessary, he's so good that you can just slap him in there if you want a more defensive focused unit, and it'll make everything feel better. But yeah, so Xingqiu will generally be the number 1 choice. I don't think anyone here is surprised. But for those of you that already have C6 Xingqiu, then a lot of the other characters can be nice. Or you just really don't like him and you don't want to play him. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you don't want to play a unit, you don't have to. Him being good doesn't mean you have to play him. And so that's why I took the time to go over the other characters as well. In any case, that's gonna do it for this Lantern Rite video. I hope you guys have a great Lantern Rite, a great rest of your patch, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.